I will speak today about something. I wrote this text, so most of the time when I'm presenting in front of a crowd, I don't necessarily have a ready text, but I was told that they're thinking about publishing the keynote speakers, so this time I've written a text. But this morning I was trying to cut it up a little bit, so it's just not me reading through the text that I've written. So what I will speak today about is that I find, well, like Petra already mentioned, this teaching and choreographing, and that's a kind of a main subject for me in the research that I do as PhD candidate here in choreographical composition is the formal title. And so what I will speak today about is something that I called, what text is called, functionality without function, relating technique to choreography. So somehow it's about, I find that the last 15, 20 years, say, of European contemporary dance at least, there's been kind of a head-on challenge on what choreography can mean, what dance can mean. And the question I'm asking is, what implications does this have on our way of thinking about dance technique? So, in my case, I've been teaching as once I fell into teaching, not in educational system first, but more professional classes to companies and so. And I started doing that more or less at the same time as I started also choreographing. So the two kind of lines have been parallel all the time. And running then this independent group that I started here in Sweden, I noticed that most of the work goes into creating the conditions to make the work, which happens in most of lines of profession, I imagine. I remember my mom, who was a teacher while she was still working, and she also said that she would spend 80% creating the situation in which the pupils could learn something. So it's not specifically because you're running an independent group in contemporary dance that this happens, but it happens to them as well. And in my case, to try to solve or to try to work around that problem, I started using the teaching very much like a kind of a lab for the choreographical work. And there are a few conditions that made this possible for me. I think it's that, like I said, I started teaching to professional companies, kind of morning classes first, and then little by little it spread. And so I've been mostly teaching in the beginning only professionals, and then kind of semi-professional and professional educations, like DOCH, for example. And that also, and most of the time, it's always been like a week, 2 weeks. So I never had that kind of a full year responsibility or putting up a program, or so. That's also, I mean, those are specific conditions that has allowed me to continue working like that. And a lot of the kind of educational or administrative dilemmas that one can run into, I've been spared from them. So that has allowed me to work like that. So these conditions have allowed me to get a specific angle on the relation of technique and choreography, and on a possible relation between the teaching and the artistic production. So I will speak from this standpoint through the topic of function and functionality. So, what is a functional movement? There will be several applications of the term throughout this text, but let's start with the basic one. In a relatively recent training form called CrossFit, functional movement is defined by the founder, Greg Glassman, as a movement that transports a maximum of weight, a maximum distance, in a minimum of time. The answer within ergonomics would speak of optimization and how the articulation of a movement, not only in relation to the body parts engaged in the motion, but the entire body, can make the movement sustainable and non-abusive. But how to speak of functional movement in dance, and what possible relation is there to find towards technique? So let's imagine an American choreographer that during the 20th century develops a movement style, a choreographic signature, that expresses her or his view of the world. The choreographer then develops a series of exercises to help the performers to develop the specific skills that this signature demands. The relation between functionality and function is then clear, one-to-one. Let's then say that the work of the choreographer becomes important or even emblematic in modern dance, and that the technique is understood not only as technique, to develop these initial specific skills related to the movement vocabulary, but as technique as such. Disconnected from its repertoire, the technique serves nothing but itself. And here we run into the first paradox of function and functionality. When the technique is detached from its original function, it becomes its own function. Technique that displays technique. There is a non-utilitarian aspect in this that I find truly artistic and even constitutive in the ontology of the artwork as a thing fulfilling itself. This thing, material or immaterial. I would say that a part of the greatness in the work of choreographers like George Balanchine and William Forsythe lays in this dissociation of technique from its purpose. In their case, the classical ballet technique detached from performing the classical ballets. And we can see it illustrated in the academic costume in a lot of Balanchine's work, or the repetitive exercise-like movement phrases that one can see in the early Forsythe work. I find this misuse of technique, the way that they're laying technique bare, very intriguing. The instrumentalist understanding of technique as means to an end is overthrown, as the means create a new end, or become their own end. There is, however, a much less fruitful outcome possible in the dissociation between the means and their end. That is when a technique starts to be defended for itself, instead for what it can do. So in difference to what I claim that Balanchine and Forsythe managed to do, by making a new expression of the art form appear out of the same technique, this separation tends to stultify a technique by consolidating it to itself. So expressed like that, it might seem similar to my claim of the artwork as being self-fulfilling, but the difference lays in what it produces. And I believe that one of the reasons to that is when an educational system becomes too remote from the professional practicing of the art form. We will return to these paradoxes of function and functionality, but first I will say something about another possible approach to technique. Since a few years already, I have seen the term technique being replaced by the term tools. And here the teacher presents a toolbox to the student, who then engages in a technique developing production by using, abusing, or discarding those tools. And even if I like the analogy of the toolbox and the labor connotation, I find it also problematic. And my point is that when we go from techniques bearing the name of its founder to a supposedly neutral toolbox, there's something about the relation to the author, because the tools also influence what they build. As the expression says, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So thus, when teaching one's own technique, one needs to be cautious with the relation individual and universal. The global backyard we live in today presents a possibility to reevaluate the relation between the individual and the collective. Postmodern society has seen the disappearance of the original through the mechanic reproduction and digital copying, but has also shown the growth of branding of personalities. The author has disappeared as a writer, only to reappear as brand, as we can exemplify with the French philosopher and writer Roland Barthes, who became the famous author of the book The Death of the Author. French choreographer Jerome Bell, his two first works can show yet another example of this paradox. So in 1994 he did a piece that was called Nom donné par l'auteur, which means then name given by the author, which is the dictionary definition of the word title. The second piece he does in 1995 is called Jerome Bell. So in the first one, the author withdraws from the most obvious imprint on the work, like naming it, saying the definition of the title, and then in the second work he does exactly the opposite and gives it his own name. And this even goes to a kind of slapstick level, as later he makes a piece that is called The Last Show, and he decides that he will stop making work, but then he gets commissioned to do another work, and he feels that it's a pity that this commission is not, that the possibility is not taken care of, so he curates a colleague of his, Xavier Leroy, to do the piece in the name of Jerome Bell. And Xavier accepts on the condition that Jerome Bell gives the title, so that he at least signs somehow. And Jerome Bell agrees and gives the title Xavier Leroy. So they start throwing the title and their names, the authorship, between them like a hot potato. In relation to this naming, I also was thinking that when I grew up, the companies that I grew up admiring in the early 90s all had names, like Batsheva, La 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 Human Steps, Ultima Ves, DV8, Rosas, and so on. But today, most of the time, the choreographers are presented by their own name. And if they have a productional unit, most of the time they're presented with both of them, as for example, Cobalt Works / Arco Rens. Another tendency in this naming, as we've lost kind of the surnames to techniques, is a more poetic naming of classes, as for example, Mobilize or Horizontal Fall. The two of them are my own contribution to the confusion, but there are more of them out there, like Flying Low from David Zambrano, or Gravity Happens, Kerstin Kusmal, Playing in the Extremes, Bruno Caverna, or Wild Wise by Kathleen Hermersdorf. So this poetic solution disconnects slightly from the author. However, I've not yet come across anyone that releases the technique from their person by letting people use their label. I've seen a lot of people using Flying Low as reference, but there is no course that you can take to become a certified teacher. The only techniques that work still that way are the somatic ones, like Feldenkrais, Alexander technique, Klein technique, body-mind centering. And as you notice of those examples, there is only one who does not carry the surname of its founder, body-mind centering. And then there is also the term practice that has appeared. And first of all, I think the greatest difference between technique and practice is that practice is shared, while a technique is taught. A practice is clearly not a thing, but something that is done. It's a subject that is a verb. Another difference is that the practice can be performed. And Deborah Hayes' performance practice has a clear imprint on this tendency. And I think the use of this term is easily connected to the late discovery of her work in Europe. So before looking closer at the understanding of the term technique, I would still like to mention the most recent version of titling technique that I've ran into. Anton Lashki presented in the program of a studio in Brussels this spring his class under the title Tonos Dance Class. And its clearness, its directness, the first association I had was like Tony's Pizza. And I think that everyone knows what a pizza is, and you go to Tony's place to have his version. And just like when you have a pizza, I think that you go to it because you like Tony, or because it's conveniently close to where you live, and because you don't feel like cooking yourself. So we will find reason later on to get back to the notion of the tool, but first I would like to address another possible semiotic solution to the problem of technique. So, is there such a thing as a technique? I will depart by proposing that technique as such derive from a specific capacity of mankind, a technical aspect in the human ontology, an aspect that we can call a function. The immaterial object of knowledge resides in our material bodies. Our bodies have the ability to learn, to produce knowledge by its own capacities, to store it, and to transmit it. I consider this technological capacity, this as a technological capacity, and that it's best understood through the Greek term techne. Following Martin Heidegger's etymological analysis, one finds techne in close collaboration with the term aletheia. Aletheia is truth being revealed, unconcealed from concealment, and techne is the human capacity to engage in that process. Techne is a form of knowing, while aletheia is a form of becoming. Techne should not be understood as a pure skill or know-how, as acquired knowledge, but that which produces the knowledge, reveals it, and therefore its close relation to aletheia. To conclude the understanding of techne, we need to also take into account two modes of becoming. Physis, the way that a tree grows from its seed, and poiesis, the manufacturing of an object, like a wooden cup made from that same tree. So poiesis demands techne, the know-how of its creator, and the creator needs the material that is created through physis. The manufactured thing Heidegger calls Zeug, that among other things means tool. And this can serve as a reminder to the not neutral aspect of the tool as mentioned in the section above. The tool doesn't only construct, but is also a construction itself. Heidegger claims that as aletheia was mistranslated from Greek to Latin, to the Latin veritas, and veritas meaning correctness of representation. This translation represents a shift of paradigm, a new way of relating to technique. And transposed back to this text's concern with technique in dance, we can quite easily see how veritas and its interpretation as true and original, the one, applies to a conventional teaching situation in which the student is supposed to embody one technique, and how the success will be measured on its correctness of representation. In this becoming, the body is turned into a tool for the technique, constructed for a certain mode of construction. And in a certain way, our genetical and biological nature given to us through physis is manufactured into a representational tool. But again, we find ourselves in the paradox of function and functionality, since the function of this tool is to represent its own functionality. Not its own functionality as body, as the unknown object of our complex nature, but the functionality of the technique that shaped the tool for its own purpose. The human has a specific relation to what the human has manufactured. We appreciate the rough diamond only because we know what we can turn it into. A raw material that disappears into usefulness, even if its sole purpose, as the diamonds, is to represent value and beauty. This fetishist relation that mankind has to its own creation is what lays behind what I characterize as the potential stultification of the technological process. A potential is reduced to a utility, and it is just as sad as when the body is defined by a potential to maximize as labor force or as consumer value. Now, a possible escape from veritas, from the one and only, is the multiple. So instead of having the technological aspect, of human ontology resulting in a technique, multiple we, propose technologies. So let's presume that technology is an inherent capacity of the human being and not something imposed or applied on it. Instead of departing from one technique, hoping that it can be applied to several forms, we can approach whatever subject we like and trust our capacity to develop technologies on our way. Instead of learning something, we develop learning. When I was educated, there was still a hope of the polyvalent performer, one who can embody all the styles. But this all-round ideal is dated. And the first solution that might come to mind then is specialization. But I think that we're past even that. Considering the complexity and variety of approaches to choreographic practices in the field today, specialization to one genre would narrow one's working opportunities radically. Instead, I think it is about specificity without specific application. Instead of aiming at a certain genre, one becomes one's own genre. So how do you collaborate with a performer that has a background in jazz dance, studied some law, plays the trombone, has a Pilates teacher certificate, worked as a sound engineer, read mostly Wittgenstein and C.L. Lewis, and enjoys figure skating? Well, you team up with another artist who decided to only work with pets, and you experiment. And you do not look for the lowest common denominator, except for maybe agreeing on doing yoga from YouTube together in the mornings. So, to resume, techne is not one. The understanding of the Greek term techne is not one, as in one technique. But it's a technifying capacity that produces technologies. Sorry, I'm just going to take this off. In the work of unconcealing the body to myself, as I would describe the technical work that I engage in, I have developed this interest in bodily function and a somewhat functionalistic approach to movement. As this text has shown, it is a productive problem of mine. On one hand, I reject functionality because of its utilitarian perspective and the following risk of a normative view that categorizes one movement as more natural than another one due to its functionality. On the other hand, having the clear physical experience of functional mobility in my own body. My first concepts of function in movement came through the Chinese martial arts techniques, Kung Fu, Qigong, and Tai Chi. But initially, I had a problem with the fact that their purpose was violent, even if merely self-defensive. So why is it that these violent techniques seem to have more to teach me about my body than the Pacific dance techniques that I had ran into? It dawned upon me that as a basic principle of homeostasis, the body was giving the motoric system and the physical proportion that it needs to assure its own survival. So even if I hopefully never will need to protect my life with my bare hands, there are reasons to train martial arts. To be able to study the movement principles that they reveal as a sort of a reversed engineering. I should also say that although I've practiced these 3 techniques ever since I started dance school, I never became a practitioner. So I cannot tell you a lot about them, but I can tell you something about how they influenced me. So this epiphany of mine regarding homeostasis has led me to a few more insights regarding the shape and movement. So if we consider the genetical information that starts to materialize in a morphological process of embryology, if we consider this a movement, it is then the movement that shapes our body. A slow movement that shapes us to our full-grown size. A movement that results in bodily shape. The shape that shapes the body's movement. The femur grows into its shape together with the muscles and the tendons and defines the leg's ability to move, and thus its function. There is a life force, a growth, that collaborates with its surrounding, fighting gravity and unfolding in the directions that its own biological material allows it, given its genetically and molecular predisposition. A true becoming, an event. A manifoldness has appeared where before there was none. Dealing with these forces and the extreme complexity of the processes at work in our body largely exceeds a traditional understanding of dance technique. The body is not there to tame and to be taught tricks. It is not even there to be understood. It is there to dive into and to wonder over. The body is not a tool for the mind. The body is a weapon, a self-defense weapon of mass construction, an abstract weapon. As gunpowder turned the martial arts weapon techniques obsolete, instead of dying, the technique turned on itself and started to develop techniques without arms, without weapons, not without arms. So the function was turned away from the utilitarian goal of war onto itself as art. Purposiveness without purpose, as Kant describes in the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment. So I spend time in search of functions in my body in the technical work, but I'm not necessarily interested in that as technique when it comes to making artwork. How is then the relation between technique and choreography when my choreographic work doesn't limit itself to the performance of the movement vocabulary that is produced through the technical work I teach? What craft am I practicing? Even if this question is at the core of my research, it remains unanswered. Clearly, they proceed with a certain parallelism, colliding, contaminating, and conflicting. Just like I described the relation of function and functionality as a productive problem, I'm starting to believe that this question is not to be answered, but to be continuously asked. The choreographical work develops technologies of its own as it proceeds, specific technologies and tools that are shaped in the process. The interests that feed the work arrives through many different channels, and by teaching, I make sure that one of those channels is movement technique. As the growth of the body, the development of that technique is a slow movement, and it is the continuous practice of work that enables it to morph, to not rigidify, and to continue to feed the choreographical work. But on the other hand, I think an understanding can be translated into another field. And in this case, it would be to discover how the understanding of functions in the bodily movement could lay at the base of an understanding of something else. Or let's say, if the understanding of bodily movement can be transposed to movement as such, be it socio-political or planetarian. I doubt that this question could be scientifically proved, and I doubt if it would be of any interest to try to do so. But since my goals are rather artistic than scientific, these doubts don't stop me from digging into this question. And still one question can be posed. If bodily understanding of movement is not at the base of understanding movement as such, what is? Where else would such understanding come from? Or any other understanding for that matter? This is an interesting question, but again it can fall into the utilitarian trap, in which I would end up advocating dance as a good way to develop skills in something else than dance. Like proving how much better you get at maths from doing dance training. Why isn't the question asked how one can get better in dance by studying maths? Could this specific knowledge that movement can provide, which I for the sake of argument will claim it can, find respect and acknowledgement without having to prove itself utile and applicable to other fields? Can our understanding of technique, choreography, and their relation to each other help in this work? What if one can change the world by changing how one perceives it? And what if that is done by changing bodily experience? The 21st century body is developing a different understanding of itself. Through contemporary philosophy and neurobiological progress, we are realizing yet another example of how a unit, the body as a singularity, is split up into multiplicities and becoming a composite assemblage. One of the landwinnings of this development is how it reveals the body-mind split as being a way too general way of categorizing the phenomenon of the human body. Strangely enough, the phenomenological tradition has played a both revolutionary and conservative role in this development. As Merleau-Ponty develops his phenomenology of perception, the prevailing understanding of the body's relation to its surrounding is challenged, as the perception apparatus shows itself constitutive of the human world, its understanding of its own body and of its surrounding. But even if Merleau-Ponty's perception theories radically changed the being of the body, it has also led to concepts of embodied knowledge that through a holistic approach seems to want to reconstitute the body as one. If Descartes' mistake was to think that mind and body are separate only because they are distinguishable, then the holistic understanding of phenomenology does the same mistake, but the other way around, by believing that the different capacities are indistinguishable only because they are inseparable. Multiplicity then becomes one multiplicity, celebrated for its uniqueness. The body is understood as something by nature good. And here I would like to present a critique to how embodied knowledge is sometimes understood by practitioners in the field of dance. It's too easy for a dance practitioner to consider themselves as the good guys because they engage with the body. The body shouldn't be reduced to feeling good and represented in a well-trained body or a smiling Buddha. Some images that you recognize. Even if Buddha is allowed to have a bit of a belly. Again, the body falls into a utilitarian and representational role. And the Western version of Buddhism has created a capitalist wellness market that happily provides us example of this logic, connecting productivity with spiritual values. I'm just going to show you, you will probably know what I mean. Obviously, the human strives to feel good and create the best conditions for survival. But within the pleasure principle, one finds as well death drive and will to power. Thus, the commercial image and its new interpretation of Darwin's device of the survival of the fittest, it needs to be supplemented with paintings by Edvard Munch and Francis Bacon. We all know the famous monk painting of the cry. There is I don't know if it's in this one, but there is also an image, yes, here, of Francis Bacon that I find pretty similar. And it could just be mentioned. There's a little anecdote, or something that Francis Bacon said in an interview, when he said, I don't paint the fear, I paint the scream. And there's a relation, I think, to affect there, where he's trying to paint the affect and not the feeling or the sensation of it. Okay, before closing this section and before my final arguing for movement as a specific mode of thinking, I would like to present a pretty radical thought that hit me just 2 days ago. As I already mentioned, I sometimes don't know how the technique I teach is related to the choreographical work. Sometimes it's very clear, but sometimes it's absolutely obscure. What if the choreographical work is already a transposition of the technical work into another form? I realize that I'm contradicting myself here, but what if dancing is good for choreography in the same way as it is good for mathematics? Obviously, the leap is not as big. It's from movement to movement, but still there is a difference. Since the technical work I engage in doesn't have this one-to-one correspondence between technique and repertory, we could consider them separate. I have a dancing practice that I carry out in teaching. I have a reading practice, a writing practice, a running practice, and a choreographic practice, and lately a basketball playing practice. They all feed off each other. I believe that by placing this wedge between dance technique and choreography, that we could possibly free them both. Contemporary choreography would not need to distance itself from dancing, since it already is remote and transposed. And dance technique wouldn't need to defend itself against the deconstructivist multiplicities of choreographical practices. So what can we learn from movement? The choreographer Edward Locke, maybe you're familiar with him, Canadian, La 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 Human Steps. He spoke at the conference Ballet Why and How, held here in Stockholm earlier this fall. And he made a point against what he called the static aesthetics. To be able to observe something, we mostly make sure that it's still. And isn't the cliché of a child removing the legs of a spider or the wings of a fly a perfect example of this? Placing things in display, immobilizing them, arresting their spatial development, making them two-dimensional with extensive quantifiable qualities, giving them vertical and horizontal coordinates. This desire for structure has clearly helped mankind in its evolution, but it needs to be balanced out with movement, with intensive parameters of speed, force, temperature, and pressure. Motion follows a logic of its own. It doesn't care about its carrier. It spreads like a virus. It shifts tectonic plates and bodily fluids. Just as we can find out things by isolating and immobilization, we can find out things by motion and mobilization. Earlier I mentioned Descartes' mistake, and maybe his mistake was exactly this one, that he was looking at the mind with the body in stillness. What if the body and the mind can only be distinguishable at rest? Leonardo da Vinci made the same mistake with his Vitruvian Man. I guess you're familiar with that, but I'll just show you anyway. By thinking that the proportion of man was square, with vertical and horizontal correspondence. But the shape that shows the square is the position that one ends up in when spinning on one's own axis. So I mean this shape. And I mean that this shape has nothing to do with this square, but that it has something to do with this. the shape that shows the square is the position one ends up when spinning on one's own axis. There have been claims that Da Vinci was succeeding with the mathematical problem of squaring the circle. And indeed, he did square a circle. He stopped the spherical spin and displayed it with 4 corners. Body and mind is in movement, and when it is one cannot separate one from the other. It is like looking at a coin spinning. You see both sides, but you can't tell them apart. And only when it stops will one side hide the other.
Thank you, Rasmus. Thank you, Rasmus, for this very thoughtful and inspiring speak. And now I assume there will be some comments, maybe questions too. Are there? We have a little time. Maybe you need to think a little bit what really happened. What did he say? Do I agree? And he needs to take some water too. Yes.
It's not that clear, but I will try. You said in the beginning something about you discussed the author. Yeah. What is your personal, so to say, you were quoting and giving examples, but how do you discuss it yourself in your work that you do?
Well, until now, like I said, there's in the work. So in the work, how I name what I teach, there is still this horizontal fall. But after reading this Tonos dance class, I'm thinking about changing it. And somehow to be more upfront and I don't know, call it like Rasmus technique or something. Or Rasmus tools or something. And the choreographic work, well, since I started here as a PhD, the practical work has a serial name. And it started with, I call them module, like module. And there's module 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in that way, I a little bit like escaped. I mean, they're still called something. They're called module, and they're called something in relation to what it is I want to do, a modular system. But we're also talking. I'm right now working on the 6th module, and I'm now with the group that I'm working. Also teaching the 3rd year BA students as a part of our artistic process, like we're teaching in a group, and we then share this practice, let's say, that we're working on with them. And we were speaking about this the other day, about how immediately when you give something a title, you narrow things down. So we were talking about, let's see if we can, when we continue now teaching and also between ourselves, to change the name of what it is we're doing. For example, we're speaking about mirroring, we're speaking about warming up without warming up, and you immediately fall into these names that you get attached to, and that they have that definition. So to see if we can give it new names and just describe it from another point of view, to sort of keep it a bit.
I really like critique, and you were delivering critique of the embodied knowledge. You said that the danger was that multiplicity became one multiplicity. Could you develop, because I didn't sort of get the thing.
Yes, no, I feel like when this that embodied knowledge appeared as a possibility for people who work a lot with the body to earn some recognition, and thinking like, I have body and I work with the body, so I have embodied knowledge. But then I feel that by thinking sometimes like then you trust too much the body, and the body becomes important in its unity of and its kind of uniqueness, you know, like it becomes the multiplicity. So exactly this thing that we were trying to escape, you end up maybe consolidating. There are different interpretations, of course, but I mean, that's my interpretation of a kind of a also from looking at it, like I see this two camps in like so phenomenology on one part, and then sort of Deleuze on the other part, and that you choose which side you're on somehow. And me not knowing a lot about these things before starting to read, I picked up on that much before I picked up on what anyone was saying. And I think that now when I'm reading it, I think that there's not so, it doesn't have to be a dichotomy between the two, even if like, but Deleuze has this expression that he says that the flesh is too ljuvt. I don't know what the translation to it in English is, like too sweet, too nice somehow. And that I think that it has something to do with that a good body is somehow too easy, and that's what I mean, that they need to be supplemented somehow with Bacon and Munch.
Yeah, thank
Bacon,
you.
that fits.
Thank you very much for
Thank
your
you.
inspiring talk. And you told us, I have one comment and one question. The comment is about your story about Xavier Leroy and Jerome Bell. But from my point of view, I want to tell the end of the story. And the end is that you probably know that Jerome Bell made 3 pieces with 3 dancers, and one dancer was Lutz Förster from the Wuppertaler Dance Theater. And this piece was called Lutz Förster. And but Jerome didn't like the piece. He didn't like it, like it was no piece, and that's why he dropped the piece out of the market. He was allowed to do it because he was the author of the piece, even when the piece was called Lutz Förster and was developed by Lutz Förster. And this is one point of the authorship, because this question of the authorship and the discourse of the authorship is also related to the market. And when we made this toolkit, we were talking with the choreographers about it. Where do you think, we asked the question, where do you think is your authorship about? And they said, oh, we did so many different things, like you told us. So we learned so different things in our career. So probably our authorship is when we are working with people, but then we even don't know, because we are working in collaboration with others, we even don't know what is mine and what is yours. So they said it's unusual to put everything together like a knowledge of contemporary art in that moment, contemporary choreography. And now is my question. I like your idea that you came back to praxis and to the term praxis, because I think in the field of dance, so the relationship between technique and technique and praxis should be, and poiesis, you also mentioned poiesis, should be reflected really more, because we use the term praxis actually in contrast to theory. But praxis, coming from these discourses you mentioned, is something very different. And probably it's very important also for didactics to reflect this term praxis in this way you did it. Probably, I didn't understand if you wanted to do that. That's what actually my question.
Yeah. No, but I think, I mean, in relation to this, the first example that I said with that Roland Barthes writes the book The Death of the Author and becomes the famous author for it, it already shows exactly the impossibility of this authorship. So just like you have then later on with Jerome Bell with these works, that they're called that, but they're still his. You know?
I liked your metaphor on the coin, the flat coin, or
Yeah.
the coin, both sides of coin. And this is just a thought. This is because when I'm dancing and I'm when in movement, I relate to the fact that my mind and body's working together, or is together. But one of the things I never feel that I let my coin lie flat on a table, so I never can separate it. So then I just wondered, what am I doing with the coin? Have I sent it out in space? I don't know, just a reflection. I really liked it. I don't, because most of the things I do is, let's say I can imaginary put the coin down, but it's always there. It's always, the dark side of the coin is always present. It's never disappears.
Yeah.
And this is maybe the space I move in between the two sides of the coin all the time.
Like you say, the other side is always there, but one can hide the other in certain conditions. You know, like when you put it flat on a table, you know that the other side is there, but you don't see it in that condition. So it's not to say that it disappears.
No, if I don't feel I hide it.
No. Yeah. 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 No, but I think, like in this metaphor, there's, I mean, that in relation to stillness and movement, that there is when you put things in stillness, you are hiding a certain side of that. I mean, hiding, not necessarily, or you're disregarding a certain side, and that's what I mean. This thing of like wanting to put what Edward Locke was calling this static aesthetic, of stopping things to be able to watch them. And of course, it's a critique against that idea. So I totally agree with what you're saying. That I'm not saying it's possible, but I'm saying that you can trick yourself into believing that it's possible.
Yes, thank you.
So, yep.
Dear friends, I'm very happy to tell you that Rasmus will be here when we're finished, because we have to stop now. And I saw there are some more questions, but he will be here.
I'm here.
Yeah. So you can talk to him, take a coffee or something, and really get deeper in the discussion. But now we have to say big thank you to you.
Thank you.